My name is Miranda, and I'm the Mayor for Vista here at the YWCA. I'll speak briefly, and then about the YWCA, and then we'll move over to Dr. Helga Hosford, who is our presenter for today. I'd like to first share with you the mission of the YWCA. The YWCA Missoula is dedicated to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. The Brown Bag Series is a component of the YWCA's Women's Economic Advancement and Racial Justice Initiatives. The 9-part lecture series provides the Missoula community a space to discover and exchange information about topics that are pertinent to women and people of diverse ethnic backgrounds. I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Helga Hosford. Helga was born and raised in Germany and moved to the U.S. in 1966 to become a German instructor. Since then, she has taught at numerous colleges along the West Coast and Montana, including Lewis and Clark College and University of Montana. And she has earned 2 master's degrees in her fields and received her PhD in German linguistics from UC Berkeley. Dr. Hosford has worked as an independent English and German translator and interpreter since 1980 and continues to reside here in Missoula today. Thanks for being here, Helga.
Thank you, Miranda, and thank you all for being here. Well, my job was to talk about Germany, and in this short time I will give you a hodgepodge of a little bit of geography, and a little bit of history, and especially the wartime, the time of the Second World War. So don't look at my art too well. Now, how big is Germany? Do you know? About as big as Montana. How many people? 83 million. We have 1. And today it is one country, but it was not at all times one country. And that part I will tell you about, because that's from which I suffered very badly. I was born in 1937. In the very east of Germany, somewhere around here. And what happened on the 1st of September of 1939? World War II began. Why did World War II begin? For exactly the same reason that we are today so interested in the Middle East. The 3-letter word, oil. Oil. So the country of Poland is very flat, and the administration of Germany at the time had to get to Romania, to the oil fields. And so this is why Poland was invaded. Of course, it was a huge amount of different propaganda, which was not quite true. So when the war started, nobody really knew that it would be a war, especially not when you lived very much in the East. So my father was an attorney, and he was a reserve officer, and he went every year to his normal maneuvers in August. And he went, and he was a very tall man, and there was no activity of war until the 1st of September, and the Poles were lying down and were shooting up. And so my father got a shot in the belly, but the Blitzkrieg, the lightning-fast war, had not made any allowances for casualties. So he died on the way to a non-existing German hospital. That was when I was 2 years old. And then my mother married again, and then we lived up here in Köslin. And from there, I still remember by the time I was 7, I heard the bombing and the artillery shots from the east, namely the Russians were coming. And the Russians were coming, and that was horrible, because there was an edict by Stalin that every German woman had to be raped, regardless of age, and the devastation was horrific. At the same time, during the war, all of Western Germany was, of course, bombed by America and Britain. France folded very early in 1940 already. And so the devastation was mainly in the West from bombings, in the East from the exploitation by the Soviets. And the memories are pretty awful. And as a 7-year-old, of course, I didn't understand what was going on, but screaming all night long of women's voices is something that stays with you and frightens you very much. Well, then we are approaching the time when the various conferences of the Allies, who were America, England, France, and the Soviets, they were allies, decided that Germany has to be, what has to happen was Germany, once it's defeated, there were several conferences, and one of them, the last one, decided that we're going to chop up Germany. And so the eastern part of Germany was given to Poland in return for some land, the Ukraine, that Stalin had stolen from Russia, from Poland, moving in Russians. And so that part was chopped off. 15 million people were expelled. And my mother and I were among them. And we fled from the Russians and going westward. Didn't get very far. This part was an old German cultural land and was a very, very important for agriculture and for just simply culture in all the respects of Germany. And so the loss of that part was really devastating. And the fleeing, there was, of course, no transportation. The transportation that had been there was all dismantled by the Soviets. They took all the rail lines and moved them to Russia, although the gauge didn't fit, and so there's still some rail areas that just rusted old tracks are lying around in Russia. Still today, they haven't been removed. So anyway, we moved westward, and the Allies decided we're going to divide Germany into various pieces. There were, of course, other ideas also. One of them was the famous Morgenthau Plan, who said that, the plan said that we should divide Germany so that it will never have an industrial power anymore and make it a whole agricultural country. Well, that didn't come about. So what they did was divide Germany into 4 slices. That is pretty bad here. And where are we? So this became the English part. Here this became the French part, but France, really, that was a matter of courtesy. This became the US part, and the rest was the Soviet part. And Berlin was chopped also into 4 pieces, and the part that was contiguous with the zone became the capital of East Germany, which the 2 German states were founded in 1948. Yeah. And so we had a West Germany and an East Germany, and we had the Federal Republic of Germany in the West and the infamous German Democratic Republic in the East. Both of them went through a totally different development. So from 48 on, we lived in somewhere around here, after we fled, and everything was lost. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, the major loss that I experienced was I was a spoiled brat. I was an only child. And I had 47 dolls and teddy bears in my room. My room was a palatial something. At least it appeared to be very large when I was little. And I was not allowed to take any doll with me. There was no toys. There was nothing to play with. And there was, of course, immediately starvation because there was no supply lines. Anyway, the division of Germany, because the western part had the Marshall Plan, which was one of the American great ideas of all the western states, including the Netherlands and Belgium and France, to rescue them with American money, while in the East, nothing but exploitation happened. And the country was robbed dry. The whole East Germany was robbed dry, and everything went to Russia. While the West was pumped full and then had the marvelous economic miracle, das Wirtschaftswunder, that immediately everything bloomed again as soon as possible. So now we're talking about 1950, and during that time we were living still in the East. The only foreign language that was available in the East was Russian. In the West, every kid learned English, French, and in most instances Latin. And of course there were lots of other languages available. But so when we finally in '52 got to West Berlin, in this little part here, I had a terrible time in school because I knew Russian, but I didn't know any English. I didn't know any French. I didn't know any Latin. And I was, in the years until I got to the university, I went to 14 different schools because there were so many different moves around. Being a refugee, you never took a hold. And I couldn't tell you what is my hometown. I don't have that. It doesn't exist because I was everywhere in different places at any one time. It was very difficult always to be the new one, and then idiot me go to America being very new. But then I was 30. I could handle that. But anyway, we finally ended up in West Berlin. And what happened with West Berlin? The wall went up. That is very hard to comprehend because the wall only went up in 1961. The division of Germany happened from 1945 on, and then the two German states, 1948. But it took until 61 until the Soviets and the Russian administration decided that East Germany should be enjailed. Why? Well, everybody knew that in the West there were TVs, there were radios, there was money to be made. And of course the country was bled dry. The East Germany was bled dry because all the intelligentsia fled. And so this is why the wall was built, and the wall is not the Berlin Wall. The wall went all over, not only around that western part of Berlin, which became an island in the Soviet-occupied German Democratic Republic, but the wall also went here, not literally the wall as we see it on the pictures, but a border in between, and you couldn't go anywhere, and there was death strips, and you heard about all of that in Berlin. The war impoverished the East Germany even further, and so one thing to defeat impoverishment is to make a lot of propaganda and lots of surveillance. So it was a state full of spies. Everybody spied on somebody else. It was a dismal situation. And then the wall fell only in 89. And so now it's one Germany. What did this whole thing mean for the population, and especially for the women? Well, number one, the whole wartime, there were no men. There were very old men, and there were 14-year-olds were even put into the war effort. So it meant that there was no males, and the women went and did all the work. They went, like here, Rosie the Riveter went into industry, into everything that that had to be built up. Women did that. Women removed the rubble from the bombings. All of it. The only difference between Rosie the Riveter in America and with the women in Germany, they did stay in the workforce. They didn't go back. When Daddy came home, they didn't go back into the kitchen. They stayed. And so the woman population in Germany is very much more liberated than we in general have here, because they stayed in the workforce. And so that difference is quite noticeable in the self-confidence of the women after the war, especially. Anyway, so where am I? So I'm still in West Berlin. However, that wasn't easy, because 80% of Berlin was bombed. There was no housing at all. And so in order to be moving to Berlin, you had to have a permit, and you had to find housing. So people lived in very strange and very primitive circumstances in the beginning, after the war. And I still remember the house that we moved into finally when my mother was able to get the permit for my grandmother and me to join her. We ended up in a house where all the neighboring houses had been bombed, and the rubble was everywhere. Berlin is very flat, but it has lots of mountains, because they're all rubble mountains. So they piled them up and made them skiing mountains. Very practical. But all the houses around our house were destroyed, and the cracks were in the ceilings, because the house in which we lived, well, it rained plaster whenever something noisy happened, because they were all so wobbly and so weak. And of course, overpopulation was terrible. We had 6 families in a one-family home, 1 bathroom. It wasn't a very aesthetic time either. So cleanliness was not godliness at that time. It was a matter of convenience, occasionally. So that Berlin went from one crisis to another. One of them was, of course, the famous blockade. You heard about that, with the Raisin bombers. Now that is one of my favorite times post-war, because what happened there was the planes that scared us to death, that bombed the country, suddenly came with food. So what the Soviets were trying is to force the West Berliners through starvation, into their territory. And so They blockaded everything, like every river. Berlin is supplied very much by rivers. And all rail lines and everything was stopped in Berlin, and no food and no people could get through. And that lasted more than a year. And then the bombers that brought us, first the bombs, then a few years later, 47, 48, brought us food. So there's dry milk, dry eggs, dry potatoes. So everything, when you're making your mashed potatoes out of the dried potatoes, that was invented during the blockade. That wasn't, everything was dry, and it was major disasters when they were trying to fly in coal. The winter of 1947 was one of the coldest on record. And so Berlin suffered severely, but it survived. The West Berliners survived, and they have a good sense of humor, and they called themselves islanders. Berlin was an island, and there was a very famous cabaret that made fun of life in Berlin under insular situations, and very much fun taking out of that, and the Berliners have a special sense of humor anyway. Well, so Berlin, of course it's my favorite town, you notice that. But it went from one crisis after the other, because then they tried all kinds, the Eastern powers tried all kinds of other gimmicks to intimidate the West Berliners. And so my mother and I decided, well, I didn't decide. My mother decided that we're going to move into West Germany. And so then we ended up, here is the Rhine River, and so we ended up here. And situation became better. We no longer had ration cards by the time 1953 rolled around, and you could buy food on the open market. It was no longer rationed. Britain, by the way, had a longer period of time of working with ration cards, because it took them longer to recuperate. They didn't get that much Marshall money than we did. And because this country was, Germany was far more destroyed. And the school situation improved. The one thing that was not discussed in school was what happened really behind the scenes in the war. Most teachers after the war were old teachers from before. And so we never heard anything about concentration camps, about the persecution of the Jews. In fact, I learned most of what I know today when I came to this country. I didn't even know the word Nazi, because it was not discussed. Somebody was in the party, in their Partei. That was it, and meaning it was only one party during the what you call the Nazi time, namely the National Socialist Party of Germany. And so members of the party, that's what it was. But the word Nazi as such, Churchill used the word Nazi, which was kind of sounded so funny to a German ear that nobody took it seriously. And the teachers didn't talk about it. And so then in the late 60s, there was when we had also the riots here and the free speech stuff. In the late 60s, only the young people demanded to know what had happened and what was during the time, and what happened to the Jewish people, what happened to the gypsies. Now you're finding everywhere, wherever you go, you're finding memorials for the time of the persecution of the Jews and the persecution of even the Sinti and Roma, the Gypsies. In Berlin there's a huge new one, and then there's a Jewish memorial, very gruesome type of a memorial. But I never learned that in school. I had no idea, and when I came here to teach here in this country, I had no idea of what had happened in Germany because it wasn't discussed. The teachers, they all had knowledge. The adults had the knowledge, but they would not share it because they might incriminate themselves. And so it was the learning experience after I came to this country was enormous, because I found out I didn't know anything about the German history that was not discussed. And it was pretty typical. Anyway, so I went to school until I was 19, and then I went to the university, and I caught up with Russian. I kept up Russian. I caught up with all the other languages. I speak English, don't I? Yeah. Yeah, kind of. and specialized in linguistics, well, did a little bit of longer studies than normally, and ended up then here in America, ending up with other degrees. So my life was typical for the large majority of people who came from the East. So I'm nothing unusual, because as I mentioned, there were 15 million people who fled or who were expelled from that part that was chopped off from Germany. And so that was, my contemporaries all have very similar stories. The generation of kids like you youngsters, what did you learn?
You know, I was just thinking of that as you were sharing that you didn't learn anything about, really the Holocaust or the Second World War, and I think it was very different for us in my generation, because I mean that was openly discussed in our history classes, obviously.
Yeah.
And we would visit concentration campsites, and like my hometown, we have it was Hitler's space town, Nuremberg.
Yeah.
And we were heavily bombed. That city was heavily bombed too, because that was his space, but a Holocaust museum, and so it was very openly discussed.
See, so that there's a totally different generation. The teachers by the time that I had were dead. And so now you had younger people who did not have that burden of the memory. And so there's when you were talking about generational differences in this country, they are far less than they are in Germany, or at least were in my time. Now I'm 76, so I mean we're talking about a lot of years here. But the idea of the learning about the real history of Germany was pretty hard to do at my time. And as you say, you had it very openly. Well, anyway, so that's the fast one here of what happened to me, but let's think about what happened to other people. As I say, for refugees like me and my contemporaries, that's nothing untypical. It's nothing unusual. But for kids in the West, those people that were bombed, my generation, it was a totally different world, because they always had the security and the safety of home. And the homelessness, I think if you ask me what was the worst part of being a war-type child, was the homelessness and the loss, and constantly losing something. And the loss also of family. All my family, my grandfather had 6 siblings, my grandmother had 13 siblings. They all lived here. We didn't know what happened to all of them. The German Red Cross was a master work of finding lost relatives. It took us 2 years to find my grandmother, and it took my grandmother 10 years to find out what happened to her husband, namely being shot after the war. So you're losing your family, you're losing the 47 teddy bears and dolls, you're losing your identity. And I think that is the most important part. If you have, as a child, constant change, always to the negative, the end result is huge insecurity. Fortunately, my mother was a very strong woman, and she caught me before I could get really crazy about the loss situation. But many people had a terrible time with adjusting to West Germany or even to East Germany when they were refugees and expellees. So it's a different identity that my generation represents from your generation. So I think the gap between you and me is much bigger than it is generally here. And the scarring that the war brought, and it is continuing as we know. Think of the Syrian kids that are fleeing. Think of the millions of refugees all over the world today. Nothing has really changed. It's just shifting in different directions, different geographies. And so we have no end in sight of children and women suffering. They just had, on KUFM, they have a radio series right now about enslavement. And there was a couple of interesting segments of how young children are being exploited and exported as slaves even today, and we haven't done anything about it. So war is horrible. I'm a very ardent pacifist, and so I hope we can prevent wars as much as we can. Questions? Yes, please.
You talked about your mother moving you around to do
Yeah.
How difficult was that for her to do? Was there, I mean, did that take years of paperwork, or?
Not until the war. So after the war, all these 15 million, they all moved westward, partially forcibly expelled from the Poles that came in and devastated very much. I'm sure that Polish children played with my dolls up here. It was not difficult to move around in the beginning. Then, of course, bureaucracy came, and then came the very famous questionnaire that you had to prove that you were not a Nazi, that you didn't belong to the party, and that you did not do any war crimes. That was an American-led investigation that everybody had to be cleared. So then there were more restrictions in moving around. And then also because of the lack of housing, you had to fill out some papers if you wanted to settle somewhere or if you wanted to get ration cards. And I think the ration cards was the most crucial part. But until the wall was built in '61, you could easily go shopping in East Berlin, and when you lived in West Berlin, you just went onto the underground train and you went shopping. It was cheaper because they had a different currency, and that was much cheaper. And so until the war, you could do that easily without any checks. And the last time I was, before the wall fell, I was with a whole group of professors who were in East Berlin. And there was controls that were kind of funny. Like we wanted to go in, we were all professors, we wanted to go into a bookstore. So in front of the bookstores there was this long bench and there were baskets. And everybody was forced to take a basket. Take the basket into the bookstore, buy your books and come out, put the basket back. That was a wonderful crowd control. When the baskets were gone, you couldn't go anymore into the bookstore. That was a crowd control to prevent riots, to prevent disgust. And so then that was all organized, supervised by the state, and this group of 40 professors with whom we were in East Berlin were so supervised too that there was constantly some very nice man with every group. Oh, can I help you? What can I do for you? What would you like to see? We were always under surveillance. And then today one of the most booming places in Berlin is the Potsdamer Platz, which is a huge industry and wonderful buildings, and there were contests of how to make interesting buildings and stuff. When I was there, the place was totally empty, no cars, and there were underground passageways, and they smelled of the sweat of fear. It was so pervasive that I still have it in my nostrils. So the East German government was intimidating terribly, and no wonder people wanted to flee. But to complete the answer to your question, the moving around was simple, and when you were in the West. Of course, Germany is very well known for its bureaucracy. We have a lot of that, yes. Other questions? Chris?
You talked about when you didn't have any knowledge of it, and then, of course, a younger generation. There was somebody about a little older than I am, so she's probably about 65 now. And she went over there after high school for a year, and she went to visit some of these places, and the people that she was living with, her homestay, wouldn't speak to her for like a week because they were so angry that she was actually trying to find out things that happened. Do you think it was just simply the passing of generations that finally made it acceptable to speak about or to learn about, or?
Well, you didn't have anything to hide if you were a different generation. You were not involved. Anybody else who was an adult at the time, I still don't believe that it is true that most people said, we didn't know what was going on. Like my mother herself said, I didn't know that there was a concentration camp 500 miles away from us or 50 miles away from us. I didn't believe, now I don't believe that. That everybody was fearful of incriminating oneself, and then the young people of her generation, they said, we need to know. And so the free speech movement was very international. I lived through that in Berkeley, here, and in Germany it was the same when the young people just went on the barricades and said, let's talk about it, and let's look at the history books that they are corrected, and now you can talk about it. But I think the older people are still quite reticent. So my generation, I was a child, but people who are older than I am would even be very fearful that they incriminate themselves. And so the myth was maintained too long that we didn't know. It's hard to say. Yes, Chris?
So did most of the families that were split up, and did they eventually all kind of find each other eventually, or is it still kind of spotty?
Oh no, you found, as I said, the Red Cross did a fabulous job. And it was a searching service that first you started out making a picture and a description on a tree somewhere, hoping that you find a long-lost relative. And also then the war-dead people, the people who were in prisoner of war camps, where that was all coming out. And so we found all my relatives, let's say until 55, 10 years, some immediately, and they are wonderful stories. Like one of my aunts had 3 little children, and her husband was in the war, like every man was, and so she stopped by my grandfather's house, and my grandfather had a boot factory. So he's had a lot of money sewn into her boot. And so she walked practically through that horrible winter with a baby carriage and her 2 little other kids that could walk. And finally she reunited in Bavaria with her husband after an incredibly arduous time and the loss of 1 child. And then they opened the boot in great anticipation. Well, all that money had become mush. However, the indelible number was still visible. So they went to the bank with this mush, and they were restored their money. But that was 5 minutes before the currency exchange, when everybody got 40 marks on each head, and everybody, there was one moment of German history when everybody was equal, had 40 marks. That was all. And of course they lost the value of that money that they got restored through that mush. So the rescue stories and stories of how people re-encounter with one another, learning how, well, many kids, we were talking about that earlier, many kids were adopted in this country. Brothers and sisters, or brothers stayed in Germany, and then 50 years later they found each other. So there are some moving stories when you are uprooted and topsy-turvy, but it's all now long ago, but it's sticking with you when you live through it. More questions?
Were you aware, or did you have any friends growing up or anything that were, taken and put in ghettos, or Jewish kids?
I don't remember that. I don't remember that, Kristen. Many people have these experiences that the neighbors were, in the middle of the night, they were taken away. But I don't remember that at all. The one thing that is probably one of the most crucial moments of my early recollections was when we fled from here toward Berlin. My mother was a nurse, and she got on a train with German wounded soldiers. The stench and the groaning of those wounded men taught me a lot of vulnerability of, I mean, a big man being mutilated. And so as a 7-year-old, I saw that quite clearly. Then we were bombed out of that train, despite the fact that there was a Red Cross on the roof of the train, and ran across mountains of rubble. And I still have the scars on my knees because I fell, of course. And then during the time when we could not get anything to eat, you got all these boils on your body. And so I have a bunch of those scars too. So it's not only the mental owies that you're carrying with you, but also some physical leftovers from that time, from all that misery. So it's, but I don't know anything about people, friends being removed, because we all were removed together or separately, and you lost sight of each other because everybody went elsewhere. What else can I answer?
Well, what do you think was the best thing that came out of that for you? I mean, as far as like, do you think that gave you the willpower to prevail and seek further education and become a very independent person? I mean, what do you think was probably the best thing that could have come out of that?
I think my whole generation was challenged, and today we don't challenge our kids enough. The challenge that was not only the survival per se, but a good survival, like for instance, that despite the fact that the neighbors had more to eat than you had, you didn't steal it from them, which would have been a logical affair. And so the ethics of respecting other people came with it because of the close living together. I mean, we were all crammed somewhere, whether it was in trains, whether it was in houses, we were all put together, and so you had to respect the other persons. I think that's one of the items, and then of course well, I guess it was put into my genes that I had to go to school a lot. Mm-hmm. That was my whole family was that way. but so that was nothing unusual. The perseverance, the horror of coming to West Berlin and not knowing any English and not any French, and above all, no Latin, that was devastating. And then I caught up during one summer with a tutor. But it was that was the lowest my ego was at that time, and I was 12 or 13, so early puberty and things. So yeah.
I was just wondering, you said your mother was a nurse.
Yeah.
How did she avoid having to join the party, since they were generally rounding up as many skilled?
I do not know whether my mother was in a party or not. I can't ask her anymore. The membership of the party was mainly centered on men. I don't know how far women were put under pressure to be party members. My mother learned to be a nurse during the war. through the Red Cross. So the Red Cross is something, a highly esteemed organization in Germany, very much more than it is here, and very much more variety of services than just the blood drawings and things, or emergency, disaster emergency help and stuff like that. I don't think that the women were big party people during the war, because I mean they had to keep the house and the children, and so the women were not. I don't think were pressured as much as the men were. The nursing came in very handy, because then after the war, when we were living in East Berlin, in East Germany, the Russians opened a hospital, mainly for the VD cases that they had caused. And so my mother was the bottle washer and nurse and anesthesiologist and everything rolled in one. And so she would have a farmer who had a boil in his neck. And so she would tell the farmer, well, it won't hurt if we have a wagon of potatoes behind the building tomorrow. So this is how she scrounged food for the people in the hospital in a very charming manner, but blackmail nonetheless. so the and that the skills that she had really helped me survive, and always a good sense of humor. There was somebody else had a question.
That's me. I was just wondering what it looked like when men did return from war, because I know that majority of the men were, gone. What did that look like when the men did come back into the community?
Well, it took many men a very long time, especially when they were in Russian prisoner of war camps. Some of them came back in 1960, so 15 years or so. Most of them were emaciated and sick. One of the things that we all had was tuberculosis. And I had tuberculosis too. And I had an encounter with the tuberculosis here in Missoula when I had to have a tuberculosis test before I started teaching. And I blew up like a balloon. One of those scratch tests. Whew, I had a reaction that was out of this world. Well, of course it was when it is in the body. And so we were all skinny. But men, when they came back, it depends on what time it was, or if there was any contact. And then the men had a terrible time too when they came out of prisoner of war camp. They couldn't find their families because everybody had moved. I mean, at least those people from pretty much the whole eastern part. You had to go and look, and that, again, the Red Cross did a marvelous job with that. And many men had a terrible time readjusting to life, and in those lost years that they had an American prisoner of war, a German American prisoner of war had a much easier life and a much easier time, and also in British prisons it was more humane. And so this difference between East and West is just enormous. Yes, please.
Was there competition for jobs then? You said the women stayed in the workforce. How did that shake down?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. The jobs that the women did were mainly women's jobs, in the sense of being, I never heard of a male nurse in Germany, only female nurses, and teachers. So there were gender-specific jobs generally, even if the women were in the industry, they were then moved into the more specific jobs that were more appropriate for women. And so there was no competition between men and women that I know of. It may have been in instances, but I don't know that there was that it was an issue. I don't think that ever came about. And then, of course, the academia was very important, because the 50% of the doctors today are female, or even more percentage. So the higher education then was open to all girls, and that made a big difference. And so girls could do the same stuff as boys could, as far as academia goes. Time. Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me.